You are going to die if you stay. Then I will die trying." Linda Armstrong could not hear the roar of the flames swallowing the truck beside her, but she felt the heat crawling up her arms like a living thing, and she did not move. She grabbed the pipe. She pulled. Somewhere behind her, a man they called Ironstone was screaming her name into the burning Arizona sky, and she could not hear that either. She just kept pulling. That is where this story should probably begin, with fire and smoke, and a girl who had no business being that close to either. But the truth is, it started long before the highway, long before the crash, long before any of it. It started in the particular kind of silence that most people only visit in dreams. Linda Armstrong had been born into that silence. She was 22 years old, and she had never heard a single sound in her entire life. Not rain on a roof, not the particular hush of a library, not her own name spoken aloud by someone who loved her. What she had instead was a pair of eyes so sharp they had learned to read the world the way most people read a book, hands that could speak faster than any mouth she had ever watched move, and a stubbornness that her physical therapist, a tired but patient woman named Catherine Dixon, liked to describe as borderline reckless. Catherine was not wrong, but Catherine also did not know what it felt like to watch your own legs begin to betray you incrementally, month after month, the way water quietly carves stone. Linda had been diagnosed 2 years earlier with a degenerative peripheral nerve disorder, the kind of diagnosis that sounded almost gentle when written in clinical terms on a printed report and felt like the slow collapse of a building you were still living inside when experienced from within. It had started with balanced minor stumbles that were easy to blame on tired feet or uneven pavement. Then it became her right leg, dragging slightly when she pushed herself too hard. Then it became falling in a grocery store in front of strangers who stared with that particular combination of pity and discomfort that she had learned to hate far more than the falling itself. The only thing standing between Linda and a wheelchair, an actual permanent wheelchair, was a surgery, a very specific procedure that a specialist in Los Angeles had explained to her in methodical written notes because there had been no interpreter available that afternoon at the clinic. The notes were thorough and precise, and the final figure at the bottom of the last page was written in plain, ordinary digits that Linda had memorized down to the last zero. $150,000, not covered by her insurance, not even partially covered. The gap between what her policy would absorb and what the procedure actually cost was wide enough to fit her entire life inside. She worked 2 jobs, days at a print shop in Scottsdale, where the owner valued her for what she actually was, rather than what people assumed her deafness prevented her from being, namely someone whose hands moved precisely and whose eyes never missed a misaligned label or a color shift on the press. Weekends walking dogs for a retired couple in Paradise Valley who tipped well and communicated through handwritten notes on a small chalkboard they kept by their front door specifically for her. She had saved $11,000 across 2 years of that math. At the rate her condition was progressing, she would need the surgery before she could ever realistically afford it. She had stopped finding that particular irony funny a long time ago. That Saturday afternoon, the last Saturday in October, the Arizona heat pressed down on the desert like something that had decided to stay permanently. Linda was driving her second-hand Honda Civic, a car whose check engine light had been illuminated for so long that she had begun to think of it as simply part of the dashboard design south on Highway 87 toward Payson. She had a physical therapy session with Catherine that had already been rescheduled twice due to scheduling conflicts on the clinic's end, and she was running 15 minutes ahead of schedule for once in her life, which felt like a small but real victory. Her hands rested loosely on the wheel. Her eyes moved constantly, the way they always did behind the wheel, scanning mirrors, watching the road ahead, checking her blind spots twice, for every once a hearing driver might bother. Her ears would never do that work for her. Her eyes had spent 22 years learning to compensate for what they could not hear, and they had become very good at it. She noticed the box truck before she consciously registered that she had noticed it. There were two large vehicles ahead of her, separated by about a quarter mile. The first was an 18-wheeler hauling industrial freight, moving steady and predictable in the right lane. The second was a dark green box truck with no company markings visible on any surface, and it was moving in a way that nagged at her attention, the way a single wrong note nags at someone with perfect pitch. It was not swerving. It was not accelerating or braking erratically. It was doing something more deliberate than either of those things. It was pacing. A cluster of 6 motorcycles had entered the highway from the on-ramp at the last exit, riding in tight formation, the kind of formation that spoke of habit and long practice. Their leather vests caught the sun. Linda could not read the patches at this distance, but she recognized the shape of the insignia the way most people in Arizona did, without necessarily being able to name the chapter or the club. It was the kind of shape that most people registered and then looked away from quickly. The box truck was not looking away. It was matching their speed with a precision that had nothing accidental about it, moving alongside the formation in a way that reminded Linda of something she had read once about how certain predators followed their chosen target for a long stretch before committing, staying just out of the range that would trigger alarm. Linda eased off the accelerator, letting more distance open up between her Civic and the vehicles ahead, the way you might step back from a stove that has not yet started smoking but already somehow smells wrong. Then the truck moved. It did not drift into the lane. It did not lose control in any way that could be attributed to a blown tire or a distracted driver or any of the mechanical or human failures that turn stretches of ordinary highway into accident scenes. It turned, hard and sudden and absolutely deliberate, cutting into the motorcycle formation from the right with the calculated precision of something that had been aimed rather than something that had gone wrong. Linda's body went rigid before her mind had finished processing what her eyes had just recorded. She could not hear the impact. She could not hear the shriek of metal or the scream of tires or the sounds that she understood logically must have been filling the air at that moment. But she felt it. She felt it through the frame of her own car, a vibration that traveled up through the road and through her tires and into her seat and her hands and her sternum, a violence so total and so sudden that her body understood it as sound even when her ears never could. Her foot hit the brake before conscious thought caught up with muscle memory. The highway ahead dissolved into chaos. One rider was thrown clear of his machine and tumbled across the shoulder in a way that no human body was designed to absorb. A second motorcycle folded beneath the box truck's undercarriage with a grinding finality she could see in the wreckage even from this distance. The truck itself did not stop. It veered forward another 20 or 30 yards before finally losing its trajectory and crashing through a low guardrail into an embankment where something inside it ignited with a rolling bloom of orange and black smoke. Other cars were stopping now. She could see it in her peripheral vision, brake lights flaring red in both directions, doors opening, people emerging onto the shoulder, their mouths open in expressions she understood without needing to hear. Nobody was running toward the fire. They stood at the edges of the shoulder, some of them raising their phones. A few of them were filming. The rest had simply frozen in place, the way people freeze when their minds encounter something too large and too immediate to fully absorb, when the gap between witnessing and acting widens into something you can fall into and not climb out of. Linda understood that freeze. She had felt it once before, years earlier, watching an accident unfold on a street corner near her apartment, and she had stood still for 3 full seconds before her legs finally moved. She had been 20 years old. She had been ashamed of those 3 seconds for months afterward. She threw the Civic into park. The heat hit her the moment she opened the door. The real heat furnace heat, the kind that makes the air itself appear to warp and shimmer. She could see clearly, at the edge of the wreckage, a shape on the ground, a large shape, a man pinned beneath something, one arm lifted weakly toward the sky, his fingers curling and uncurling against the asphalt as though trying to claw his way out of the earth itself. A woman near Linda grabbed her arm as she moved past. Linda could not hear what the woman was saying, but she read the shape of the words on her lips without difficulty. The same words people always said in these moments. Too dangerous. Wait for help. Someone is coming. Just wait. Linda pulled her arm free and kept walking. She had spent her entire life being told to wait. Wait for someone to notice her raised hand in a classroom that never had an interpreter available fast enough. Wait for a doctor's office to locate someone who could translate. Wait for her turn, her moment, her chance always somewhere just beyond the next appointment, the next rescheduled session, the next door she would need to push open herself because it would not open on its own. She was done waiting. The closer she moved toward the wreckage, the worse the heat became, until it felt like a physical presence pressing against her skin, something with weight and intention. She could see the man clearly now. He was enormous, at least 6'3", built across the shoulders, like someone who had spent decades in physical labor, with a gray beard soaked dark with blood and sweat, and a leather vest covered in patches that she noted without fully processing. He was pinned beneath a section of the truck's engine block that had been thrown free by the initial collision and landed across his lower body with crushing force. His eyes found her as she dropped to her knees beside him. Even through the pain that was etched across every line of his face, something sharpened in his expression the moment their eyes met. He looked at her the way people sometimes did before they spoke, assessing whether she could hear them. Then his mouth moved. Get back, get away, go. Linda shook her head once hard and looked at the engine block. It was too heavy to move with her hands alone. She understood that immediately, the way her body understood weight and leverage, that particular combination of instinct and practical knowledge built up across years of loading print runs and moving equipment at the shop. Her eyes swept the wreckage until she found what she needed, a length of steel pipe torn loose from somewhere in the truck's undercarriage, long enough to give her purchase, heavy enough to hold. She grabbed it and wedged one end beneath the edge of the engine block. She braced the other end against her shoulder and positioned her feet the way she had watched mechanics position themselves when they needed to move something that was not meant to be moved by a single person. The man's hand found her wrist. He was pushing her away, pushing with more strength than a man in his condition should have had, left his whole upper body straining with the effort of trying to force her back from the fire. She pulled her wrist free and threw her weight down onto the pipe. The engine block shifted, not much, an inch, maybe two, enough for her to feel that it was possible. Sweat was already burning in her eyes. Her arms trembled with the effort. Somewhere behind her, she felt rather than heard, the moment the fire found new fuel, a change in pressure, a wave of heat that rolled against her back like a fist. She threw more weight. The block shifted again. 3 inches now. Enough. She dropped the pipe and got her hands beneath the man's arms, hooking her fingers behind his shoulders, and pulled. He was too heavy. She knew that with the part of her mind that was still capable of doing arithmetic in the middle of a disaster. 260 pounds of dead weight against however many pounds she had after 2 years of watching what she ate in order to have enough money for her medical savings fund was not a calculation that ended in her favor. But something in him understood what she was doing. Even broken, even pinned in pain, he found something left in his legs and pushed against the ground with it, helping her drag himself, those last grinding feet, away from the undercarriage. His mouth was still moving. She was close enough now to read it. It's gonna blow. Leave now. Go. She did not leave. She got her shoulder under his arm and hauled him another yard. and then the pressure in the air changed in a way that she felt in her teeth and in the base of her skull, a warning delivered through her body rather than her ears. She threw herself over him. The truck exploded. The force of the blast lifted her off the pavement and brought her down hard on the other side of him. For one extended white moment, there was nothing at all, no pain, no heat, no awareness of anything except a complete and very peaceful absence of sensation, and then the world crashed back in through a body that did not want to cooperate. The last thing she registered before the darkness came for her was his arm, his enormous arm wrapping itself around her back in the half-second before impact, trying to pull her smaller body beneath his even as he lay broken and burned and entirely unable to protect anyone, his mouth moving one final time, shaping words she could read even through the smoke and the ringing absence of sound. You did not have to do that, but you did. Linda woke to white light and the particular antiseptic clarity of a hospital room. Her hands were bandaged, her ribs ached with every breath. There was a dull, persistent throb along her hairline where she had apparently connected with the pavement. When she tried to sit up, a wave of dizziness hit her so hard she had to grip the bed rail with both hands just to keep from sliding sideways. A nurse appeared at her bedside within seconds, her mouth moving in the rapid, overlapping pattern of someone who had forgotten, in the urgency of the moment, that speed and volume were not the same obstacle. Linda raised one bandaged hand and signed as clearly as her trembling fingers allowed. The nurse stopped, blinked, then nodded and reached for a notepad on the bedside tray with the particular scramble of someone shifting gears in real time. She wrote, "You are at Verde Valley Medical Center, Highway 87 accident, second-degree burns on your hands and forearms, mild concussion, bruised ribs. You are going to be okay." Linda read the words twice, then grabbed the pad and wrote, "The man, the biker, is he alive?" The nurse hesitated. Just a flicker, just long enough. Then she wrote, "He is alive, critical but stable. You saved his life. Everyone is talking about what you did." The relief hit Linda so hard and so fast that her eyes burned with sudden tears, and she had to look away toward the window, toward the flat light of late afternoon, pressing against the glass, pressing herself to stay composed in front of a stranger. She did not know his name. She did not know anything about him beyond the weight of his arm around her back in the half-second before everything went white. Knowing he was alive settled something in her chest that had been clenched since the moment she had run toward that fire. It was almost an hour later when the door to her room opened and admitted someone who did not look like hospital staff at all. He was lean rather than bulky, with a shaved head and a close-trimmed goatee, wearing a leather vest similar to the one the man in the wreckage had been wearing, though the patches on this one were arranged differently, a position, a rank, something Linda did not yet have the context to interpret. His eyes swept the room once in a practiced complete arc, cataloging every exit and every corner, before his gaze settled on her with a directness that was somehow less intimidating than it should have been. He knocked on the door frame out of habit and waited until her eyes found him before stepping inside. He held up a small whiteboard, already written on, already prepared. "My name is Waylon Cross. Everyone calls me Ghost. I ride with Stone Decker, the man you pulled out of the fire. He wants to thank you himself. Is that okay?" Linda studied the man's face for a long moment. There was something guarded in his expression, something careful beneath the politeness. She nodded slowly and signed, watching to see how much he understood. He understood enough. He wrote back, "Got it. He's 2 doors down. Not supposed to have visitors yet, but the nurses are not going to stop us." He helped her into a wheelchair and pushed her down the hall with a gentleness that seemed almost at odds with the hard lines of his face. The room they entered was heavy with machines, monitors blinking in patterns she could see but not hear, IV lines and oxygen tubing arranged with clinical precision around a bed where a man lay propped against pillows with bandages wrapped thick around his torso and one leg elevated. She could finally see him clearly. He was in his early 50s, she estimated, thick gray beard trimmed, close gray hair pushed back from a face that had been weathered by decades of sun and wind, and based on the older scars visible along his jaw and forearms, considerably more danger than the average man his age encountered on a regular basis. He was the kind of man who took up space without trying to, even flat on his back in a hospital bed, even tethered to more equipment than she could easily count. He had a presence that made the room feel smaller. His eyes found her in the doorway and went through several rapid shifts. Surprise, something that looked almost like disbelief, and then settling beneath both of those a raw and unguarded gratitude that made him look for just a moment considerably younger than his years. He gestured for the whiteboard Waylon was carrying and wrote with a hand that still trembled slightly from blood loss and pain medication. "They tell me you are the reason I am alive." Linda read it, then looked up at him and signed slowly, watching his face. "You did not have to protect me in the explosion. You could have used that last bit of strength to get yourself further clear. You chose to pull me under you instead." Waylon translated haltingly, stumbling over a few signs but getting close enough. Stone's expression shifted, something fierce and immediate that had nothing to do with his injuries. He grabbed the whiteboard and wrote quickly, pressing down hard. "I do not leave people who put themselves in the fire for me. Not ever. My name is Stone Decker. People call me Iron, though I am starting to feel considerably less like Iron at the moment." Linda felt something settle in her chest at the name, at the quiet certainty behind it. She signed back, "I am Linda Armstrong. I just did what anyone should have done." Stone's expression when Waylon finished translating was almost fierce in its disagreement. He wrote, "Nobody else moved. You saw that, did you not? Dozens of people standing there, phones up, and you were the only one who ran toward it." Linda did not have an easy answer for that. The truth was complicated in a way that did not fit neatly onto a whiteboard. It had something to do with a lifetime of being told to wait, and something to do with the particular clarity that her silence sometimes gave her in moments of chaos, a problem to be solved rather than a sound to be afraid of. She signed simply, "I could not just stand there and watch." Before Waylon had finished translating the sentence, the door to Stone's room opened again. A man stepped inside who did not belong to the hospital and did not belong to the club. He was in his 40s, wearing a rumpled sport coat over a detective's badge clipped to his belt, and his expression carried that particular professional neutrality that Linda had learned over years of navigating institutions that were not built for her, usually preceded some form of inconvenience. Detective Justin Blackwood. His introduction was clipped and efficient. His eyes moved from Stone to Linda and then back to Linda with a flicker of something she could not quite name. Not hostility, not indifference, something colder than either. He spoke directly to her, slowly and clearly, with the deliberate enunciation people sometimes adopted when they first learned they were talking to someone deaf, overcorrecting in a way that was well-intentioned and faintly condescending in equal measure. He was asking about the accident, what she saw, the details of the truck. Linda nodded and reached for the notepad, ready to write exactly what she had observed: the truck's deliberate pacing alongside the motorcycle formation, the precise and sudden turn into the cluster of riders, the way the whole thing had felt, not like a loss of control, but like the execution of something that had been decided long before the truck ever reached that stretch of highway. She wrote it all out clearly and in detail. Blackwood read it, and something in his expression tightened almost imperceptibly before smoothing back into practiced neutrality. He wrote back on his own pad, "You witnessed a traumatic explosion and were likely disoriented. These things often appear intentional in the moment. Investigation typically reveals driver error, mechanical failure, or environmental factors." Linda felt a sharp, clean flare of frustration rise through her chest. She took the pad back and pressed down hard. "I watched that truck pace itself alongside those motorcycles for almost a full mile before it turned into them. That is not distraction. That is not driver error. I know the difference between an accident and a decision. Blackwood's expression shifted for just a fraction of a second, a flicker of something behind the professional composure that came and went too fast to read clearly. Then he offered her a thin, smooth smile that did not reach his eyes at all. He wrote, "We will look into every possibility. Thank you, Miss Armstrong. You should focus on your recovery." He left without waiting for her to respond, and Linda watched his back with a growing unease that settled into something colder and more specific than ordinary discomfort. That dismissal had been too fast, too smooth, too eager to close a door that should have been standing wide open. The moment he was gone, Waylon moved to the door and pushed it fully closed. Stone, who had been watching the exchange from his bed with sharp, alert eyes despite everything his body had just been through, grabbed the whiteboard again. He wrote with a new and harder urgency, "That man is not going to help us. Waylon, tell her what we know." Waylon crouched beside Linda's wheelchair so she could read his lips directly, forming his words slowly and deliberately. "That crash was not random, Linda. That truck was aiming for Stone specifically. We have had threats for weeks. A cartel operation has been trying to push product through Iron Desert territory for close to a year. Stone refused every approach. They decided that refusal was no longer acceptable." Linda's stomach dropped, a cold, sick lurch that had nothing to do with her injuries. She signed carefully. The detective knows this, and he is still calling it an accident. Waylon's jaw tightened. He glanced at Stone before answering. "Stone believes Blackwood has been on someone's payroll for months. Too many incidents in this county involving the wrong people have been written up as nothing. We have suspected it for a while. Tonight made us certain." Linda sat with that for a moment. She had gone from a witness who happened to see something terrible to something else entirely in the span of a single conversation. The only person alive who could contradict whatever official story someone was already working to construct. She signed, her hands moving faster now. "If I am the only person who says it was intentional and the detective wants it recorded as an accident, what happens to me?" Waylon did not answer immediately. He looked at Stone. Stone, despite the bandages and the brace and the visible effort that every small movement cost him, pushed himself up slightly against his pillows. His eyes locked onto Linda's across the room with an intensity that required no translation whatsoever. He picked up the whiteboard and pressed the marker down so hard it nearly split the tip. "Nothing happens to you. That is a fact, not a promise." He paused, then added beneath it in smaller but no less certain letters, "You are family now, whether you want to be or not." Linda stared at the words for a long moment. Something complicated moved through her chest, gratitude and fear and a warmth she did not yet have the vocabulary to name, a warmth at being claimed so absolutely by a man she had known for less than 3 hours, whose entire world appeared to operate on principles of loyalty and danger in roughly equal measure. Before she could sign a response, the monitors beside Stone's bed erupted into a visible cascade of flashing alerts, numbers spiking across every screen in a pattern that made Waylon's head snap toward them instantly. Stone's face had gone the color of ash sweat, breaking out along his hairline. His breathing suddenly labored in a way that Linda could read without needing to hear a single gasp. Waylon was at the door in 2 strides, pulling it wide and waving down the hallway with both arms. Within seconds, a team of nurses and a physician came running in past Linda's wheelchair, working with the focused, urgent speed of people who had trained for exactly this. They surrounded Stone's bed. Someone pushed Linda back into the hallway. She sat there in her wheelchair in the corridor outside his room, watching through the narrow window in the door as the medical team worked over him, as Waylon stood pressed against the far wall with his fists clenched and his face carved from something harder than stone. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours before the frantic energy inside the room finally began to settle. A doctor emerged eventually and spoke to Waylon. Waylon turned to Linda immediately and signed what the doctor had said. His movements clumsy but determined. Internal bleeding from the crash. They almost missed it. He needs surgery. Right now. Linda watched them wheel Stone's bed out of the room at speed, his eyes finding hers for one brief, fierce second as he passed through the double doors at the end of the corridor. Something in that glance that needed no translation, a refusal, a pure and absolute unwillingness to be finished yet. She sat alone in the hallway as it filled with more members of the club, men and women in leather vests, arriving in ones and twos, drawn by whatever network of communication existed in that world. Several of them nodded at Linda as they passed. One older man with a gray braid down his back paused beside her wheelchair and placed one large weathered hand briefly against his chest and inclined his head before moving on. She did not fully understand yet what she had stepped into. She only understood that somewhere behind steel doors at the end of that corridor, a man was fighting for his life for the second time in the same day. A man who had, in the middle of his own agony, still found the instinct to wrap himself around her body before the blast hit. Whatever came next, she was not going to be the person who stood at the edge and watched. It was past midnight when Waylon finally appeared in her doorway again. One look at his face told her what the words confirmed a moment later, written on the whiteboard with a hand that was less steady than usual. Surgery went okay. He is stable, not out of the woods yet, but he is fighting. Linda closed her eyes, let herself breathe for the first time in hours. When she opened them, Waylon was still watching her with an expression she had not seen from him before, something more open than his default guardedness, something that looked with careful precision like respect. He wrote one more line before turning toward the door. Whatever happens next, you are not facing it alone. Not anymore. Linda read the words twice, set the whiteboard down in her lap, looked at her own faint reflection in the dark window across from her bed, bandaged and bruised and exhausted and still somehow breathing. Outside this hospital, a truck had been deliberately aimed at 6 men on a public highway. A detective with a badge had already moved to bury the truth before it fully surfaced, and a man built like something out of a rougher century had spent his last conscious moments trying to shield her from an explosion instead of saving himself. Nothing about her life was going to look the same after today. She understood that with a clarity that had nothing to do with sound and everything to do with the particular silence she had lived in her entire life. A silence that had taught her to trust what she felt far more than what people tried to tell her, and what she felt now sitting alone in a hospital room with bandaged hands and a body that ached in every possible direction was not fear. It was resolve. Somewhere down that hallway behind steel doors and a wall of people who had chosen each other the way families are supposed to be chosen, Stone Decker was fighting to survive a war that had started the moment a truck turned deliberately into his riders on an empty desert highway. And Linda Armstrong, deaf since birth, broke injured and entirely unwilling to look away from danger the way the world always seemed to expect her to, had already decided somewhere deep in the quiet, unshakable core of herself that she was not finished either, not even close. The morning light had not yet broken through the blinds when the door to Linda's room opened without a knock. A woman in scrubs stepped inside, moving with an efficiency that Linda's eyes caught as wrong before her conscious mind had assembled the reason. The badge clipped to her breast pocket, the tray she carried, the syringe on that tray. Linda's eyes went to the badge first. Too bright. The laminate still carried the faint sheen of something recently printed, none of the soft edge wear that every other staff badge in this hospital had accumulated across months of use. She had been watching those badges since she arrived, the way she watched everything cataloging details that her ears would never supply. The woman's mouth moved. Time for your morning medication, sweetheart. Linda did not move. She kept her eyes on the woman's face and reached slowly, deliberately, for the notepad on her bedside tray instead of extending her arm. She wrote, "What medication? Nobody told me about any morning medication." The woman's smile flickered, gone before most people would have caught it, but Linda caught it. She wrote quickly on the corner of her own clipboard and turned it toward Linda. "Standard pain management. Doctor's orders. This will only take a moment." Linda looked at the syringe, looked at the badge, looked back at the woman's face and the way her eyes kept pulling toward the door, toward the hallway, the way a person's eyes moved when they were far more invested in what might walk in than in the patient they were supposedly treating. She reached for the call button on the bed rail. The woman's hand closed around Linda's wrist before she could press it. Fast, hard, without any of the gentleness a real nurse would have used, the gentleness Linda had felt from every actual staff member who had touched her since she arrived. In that single motion, Linda understood with complete certainty that her instinct had been right. She twisted her wrist free with a sharp, violent motion she had never used on a person before, but that her body apparently knew how to execute anyway, and slammed her free hand down on the call button. At the same moment, the door to her room burst open. Waylon Cross filled the doorway. The change in the woman's face was instantaneous. The professional composure dissolved into something fast and calculating, her hand lunging toward the tray, toward the syringe, and Waylon crossed the room in 2 strides and had her wrist pinned against the wall before she had gotten within a foot of Linda's IV line. The syringe clattered across the floor. Real nurses came running, drawn by the alarm, and within seconds the room was full of movement and people. Security appeared from somewhere down the hall. The woman, her cover entirely gone, was shouting something at Waylon that made his face go pale and then hard with a fury that Linda had never seen on a human face before. Security removed her. The room slowly emptied of everyone except Waylon, who stood rigid near the door with his hands still curled into fists at his sides, the adrenaline working through him visibly. When the room had cleared enough for him to reach Linda's bedside, he grabbed the whiteboard with hands that were shaking slightly. That syringe was not pain medication. Security is testing it now, but I already know what was in it. That was meant to stop your heart, Linda. Clean. They would have called it a complication from your injuries. Nobody would have looked twice. Linda read the words until they blurred slightly at the edges. Her own hands were trembling now, the delayed shock settling into her chest like a stone dropped into still water. She wrote back, her handwriting jagged. They tried to kill me in a hospital, in the morning, with people everywhere in the hallway. Waylon's expression when he looked at her carried none of the reassurance she desperately wanted from him. He wrote flat and honest, the way people write when they decide that truth serves better than comfort. That is exactly why they did it here. Nobody expects it here. Soft target. And they almost got away with it because nobody was watching closely enough. Nobody except him. He had not left the floor all night. Linda understood this now in the same way she was beginning to understand many things about Waylon Cross, by what she observed rather than what he said. He had been standing somewhere just outside her room, in the dark for the entire night, invisible, watching. She signed, forcing her hands to stop trembling enough to form the words clearly. "Does Stone know?" Waylon shook his head, still in recovery. "But I am calling in more people. What just happened in this room is a different kind of situation than what we were already dealing with." Within the hour, Linda's room had become something else entirely. 2 enormous men in leather vests took up positions on either side of her door, arms crossed, eyes tracking every person who passed in the hallway with an intensity that made the nursing staff visibly uncomfortable. A third pulled a chair directly to her bedside, close enough to react to anything that moved wrong. Linda had never in her life felt so simultaneously protected and so profoundly unsettled. A physician came by mid-morning, her badge worn and authentic, her manner matter-of-fact and practical. She checked Linda's bandages and wrote on the notepad with clinical efficiency, "Your burns are healing well. The ribs will take several weeks. Given what happened this morning, hospital administration is discussing discharge options as soon as you are medically stable, for everyone's safety." Linda read it twice, then wrote back, "You are asking me to leave because someone tried to kill me while I was in your care." The doctor's face carried genuine sympathy and a helpless honesty that Linda found she respected more than a rehearsed reassurance would have felt. "We cannot secure this building against the kind of access that woman had. The badge she carried got past 3 checkpoints. That is not something we can promise will not happen again." The man sitting closest to Linda's bed, heavy-set with a shaved head and a neck tattoo she had not had the composure to examine closely until now, leaned forward and touched the doctor's arm gently to get her attention. Then he made a simple gesture toward himself and toward Linda. "We have her." The doctor seemed to understand immediately, some visible tension leaving her shoulders. She nodded and wrote one last line before stepping back. "We will expedite the discharge paperwork. I am genuinely sorry, Miss Armstrong, and I mean that." By early afternoon, Wayland brought news that made the tightness in Linda's shoulders ease for the first time in hours. Stone was awake, still weak, still tethered to more equipment than Linda could count, but conscious and asking for her by name in a voice so rough from the breathing tube that the nurses had begged him twice to stop trying to use it. Wayland wheeled her down himself, flanked by 2 more members of the club whose expressions stayed flat and watchful while their eyes moved constantly over everyone they passed. Stone looked smaller in the hospital bed than Linda's memory of him from the highway, which made no logical sense given that he was the same man. But there was something about the tubes and the pallor of his skin and the effort it took him to simply turn his head toward the door that made him seem, for the first time since she had met him, mortal, in a way she had not let herself fully register during the hours she had spent in the dark outside his surgery. His eyes found her, and something in his face released, some tension he had been holding since the moment his eyes had closed on that burning highway, finally let go, the moment he confirmed with his own vision that she was actually there, actually breathing, actually in front of him. He reached for the whiteboard, his movements slow and deliberate, and wrote in handwriting considerably shakier than the night before. "Wayland told me what happened this morning. I should have had more people on your room from the start. That is on me." Linda shook her head firmly and signed, waiting for Wayland. "This is not your fault. You were in surgery." Stone's jaw tightened when he heard the translation, and he wrote back with a fierceness that pushed through even his obvious exhaustion. "It does not matter. You are under my protection. That is not a suggestion. That is simply what it is. Whoever sent that woman needs to understand very quickly that it was the last move they will be given the opportunity to make." Wayland added afterward, his expression dry, "He means that literally. Just so you have a complete picture of what you have walked into." Linda felt a complicated warmth settle in her chest alongside the genuine fear. She had grown up her entire life being underestimated, managed, treated as fragile in all the ways her deafness seemed to give people permission to assume that the limitation in her hearing implied limitations in everything else as well. Nobody had ever looked at her the way Stone Decker was looking at her right now. Broken, bandaged, barely conscious, radiating absolute fierce commitment to her safety that felt nothing at all like pity and everything like a promise being kept. She signed slowly. "Why, you do not know me. I did what anyone with a conscience should have done." Stone's response, once Wayland finished translating, hit her harder than she had expected. "Nobody else did, though. You did. In my world, that means everything. You do not walk away from someone who ran into fire for you. Not ever. Not for any reason." Outside the window of Stone's room, the Arizona afternoon was deepening toward evening, the sky turning those particular shades of orange and purple that Linda had always loved about the desert at this hour. She had driven that highway 100 times. She had driven it without ever imagining that one afternoon it would rearrange every piece of her life. She looked at the man in the bed beside her, at the bandages and the machines and the stubborn, undiminished intensity in his gray eyes, at Wayland standing near the door with his arms crossed and his gaze on the hallway steady and immovable. She thought about what it had felt like to run toward that fire when every single other person on that highway had chosen to stand still. She thought about her legs, about the surgery, about the $11,000 in her savings account that represented 2 years of doubled shifts and skipped meals and refused social invitations. She thought about the detective who had already moved to close the door on the truth before the smoke had even cleared. And she understood with a clarity that surprised her with its completeness that whatever world she had been living in before that afternoon on Highway 87 was no longer the world she was living in now, not because someone had decided it for her, but because she had made a choice on a burning stretch of desert road, and the choice had brought her here, to this room, to these people. She had run toward the fire, and the fire had changed everything. William Slater arrived near sundown. He was younger than most of the men she had seen surrounding Stone, late 20s with sharp, watchful eyes and none of the visible club patches the others wore. He dressed in plain, unremarkable clothes that somehow made him stand out more among the leather vests surrounding him. He carried a laptop and a folder and the particular expression of someone who has been awake long enough that their face has stopped trying to hide what their body knows. Wayland made the introduction, and then to Linda's surprise, William stepped forward and signed directly to her, slowly, imperfectly, clearly self-taught across the last several hours rather than fluent across years. But the effort was unmistakable, the effort of someone who had decided that real communication mattered more than the convenience of working through a translator. He signed, "I learned a few signs on the way here. Not many. I am sorry." Linda signed back slower and simpler than she usually spoke, something unlocking in her chest at the simple fact of the attempt. "Thank you. That means more than you know." William nodded, visibly relieved, and pulled his folder open. He switched to writing, his handwriting compact and precise, a man clearly accustomed to organizing information quickly and accurately. "I pulled financial records, property filings, and shipping manifests connected to the box truck's registered owner. The truck belonged to a shell company. I traced that shell through 2 more layers before the trail dead-ended in a holding account registered in Nogales. The same pattern appears in 3 separate cartel-adjacent operations I have tracked in this region over the past 18 months. Linda read it carefully, then wrote, "The detective knows the truck was not an accident. He is on their payroll." William looked at Wayland. Something passed between them, a confirmation rather than a surprise. William wrote back, "Stone has believed this for months. Tonight's events have removed any remaining doubt. Blackwood's bank accounts show 3 separate deposits in the last 6 months, each structured just below the federal reporting threshold. 2 of those deposits trace back through intermediary accounts to the same holding company that registered the truck." The implication settled over Linda in the quiet of Stone's hospital room with the particular weight of something inevitable rather than something unexpected. She was not merely a witness to a crime. She was the one person who could contradict the official story that someone with money and institutional access was already constructing with great care, and that person had already sent one agent to a hospital room in the early morning hours with a syringe that was not what it was labeled. She signed, her hands entirely steady, now, the clarity of the situation burning through her fear like sunlight through smoke. "What do we do?" Wayland answered without hesitation, his handwriting firm and absolute. "We move you tonight, somewhere they cannot reach, and we make sure whoever is giving Blackwood his instructions understands that there is now a wall around you that no amount of money is going to buy a way through." Stone, who had been listening to Wayland's abbreviated translation of the exchange, caught Linda's eye from his bed. He did not reach for the whiteboard this time. He simply held her gaze with an expression that said everything the whiteboard would have struggled to contain. I see you. You are not alone. This is not over, but you are not alone. Linda held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded once, slowly feeling something settle deep in her chest that had not been settled in a very long time. Whatever had started on that burning highway, whatever was coming next, she was going to face it with her eyes open. That was the only way she had ever known how to face anything. The discharge process moved faster than Linda had thought medically possible. Hospital administration apparently motivated equally by genuine concern for her safety and by the institutional anxiety of having twice failed to prevent a murder attempt on their premises within the span of a single night. By 10 o'clock that morning, Linda found herself being guided through a rear service entrance by Wayland, flanked by 4 club members, toward a line of vehicles assembled in the loading dock with an efficiency that spoke of long practice at moving quickly when the situation demanded it. She was helped into the back seat of a black SUV with windows tinted dark enough that no one outside could have identified the occupants. Wayland climbed in beside her. William took the front passenger seat and immediately opened his laptop with the focused urgency of someone who had not stopped working since the moment the night had gone wrong. As the convoy pulled out, Linda counted the vehicles, 6 total, with motorcycles woven between them, riding in a formation that felt less like an escort and more like a moving perimeter. She watched the hospital shrink in the side mirror and felt the surreal, vertiginous reality of her situation crash into complete focus for the first time since the accident. 36 hours ago, she had been an ordinary young woman driving to a rescheduled physical therapy appointment, carrying the ordinary weight of her ordinary, impossible financial problem. Now she was in an armored convoy, fleeing a corrupt detective and the people who paid him, surrounded by men whose loyalty to her was as fierce as it was, by any reasonable measure, inexplicable. Wayland noticed her staring out the window and tapped her shoulder gently, then wrote on a small notepad balanced on his knee. "You doing okay?" Linda thought about it honestly before answering. "No, but I am alive. I will take it." The corner of Wayland's mouth shifted into something that was not quite a smile, but carried real warmth nonetheless. He wrote back, "That is the right attitude around here. Alive today. Worry about tomorrow when it arrives." They drove for nearly 2 hours, the paved highway eventually giving way to a gravel road that wound through increasingly rugged terrain, climbing into mountain country where the scrub brush grew thick on either side and the road curved constantly enough that anyone following would have had a difficult time staying unseen. The road ended eventually at a cluster of buildings set back into the mountainside that Linda had not expected. It was not a clubhouse in any sense that matched what she might have imagined from the outside. This was something considerably more substantial, a compound built into the landscape, several structures connected by covered walkways with clear sight lines in every direction, and a perimeter fence that Linda noted, even in the failing afternoon light, was equipped with considerably more technology than simple ranch wire. William, catching her studying the fence from the SUV window, turned in his seat and wrote quickly, "Stone bought this land 15 years ago, spent a decade building it out. Most people do not know it exists." The SUV stopped in front of the largest building. As Linda stepped out stiff from the drive and aching in her ribs, she was struck immediately by how many people were already gathered there. Men and women in leather vests, a mixture of ages, their expressions moving from curious to protectively alert the moment they registered who was stepping out of the vehicle. Several of them nodded at Linda. 2 of the women moved toward her immediately, their body language conveying welcome rather than wariness. An older woman stepped forward before any of them reached Linda. Gray hair pulled back in a practical braid, her face lined with the particular toughness that comes from decades of taking the weather as it came. She offered Linda a warm, steady smile and held up a piece of paper she had clearly prepared in advance. "My name is May Decker. I am Stone's sister. We have a room ready for you. There is food and you are safe here. I promise you that. Something about the simplicity of the promise delivered by someone who had every reason to be suspicious of a stranger dropped without warning into the center of her world, settled a small piece of the chaos in Linda's chest. She found herself nodding, sudden unexpected tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. May led her inside through hallways lined with photographs she did not have time to examine, into a small but comfortable room with a real bed and clean linens, and on the bedside table, hooked into a wall outlet, and clearly recently installed a vibrating alarm system, the kind designed specifically for deaf users. May noticed her noticing it and wrote, "Stone had one of the boys install that a few hours ago from his hospital bed. Said you would need to feel an alert rather than hear one. He does not do anything halfway, even when he is flat on his back in surgery recovery." Linda stared at the small device for a long moment. Something in her chest tightened with an emotion that did not have a simple name. In 22 years of moving through a world that rarely bothered to think about her without being prompted, nobody had ever anticipated a need like this without being asked, without being reminded, without making her advocate for the basic consideration of her own existence. She wrote back, her hand trembling slightly. "Thank you. This means more than I can explain." May squeezed her shoulder briefly and stepped toward the door. "Rest. Tomorrow will be a long day. We have a great deal to figure out." Linda did not sleep well. She woke 3 times in the dark, heart pounding for reasons her body remembered, but her conscious mind had to reconstruct each time. Every shadow that moved across the wall, every shift of the building settling into the cold desert night. Each time her rational mind caught up and reminded her perimeter fence, multiple guards, armed people who had decided she mattered. Each time the rational argument worked eventually. By morning, she found Waylon and William already awake in the main building's kitchen, bent over William's laptop with matching expressions of controlled alarm. When they noticed her in the doorway, Waylon waved her over with an urgency that set her nerves back on edge before she had taken 3 steps toward him. William turned the laptop toward her. A local news article published while they slept with a photograph of the highway wreckage beneath a headline that made Linda's jaw tighten in cold fury. Motorcycle gang violence linked to Highway 87 collision. Crash investigation ongoing. She read the article twice. No mention of the box truck's deliberate trajectory. No mention of witnesses. Instead, a carefully constructed narrative of implied internal conflict, vague references to known criminal enterprises, and the kind of clinical language that turns something brutally specific into something comfortably ambiguous. She wrote, "This is a lie. This is deliberately false." Waylon wrote back, his expression unsurprised, but grim. "Blackwood's work. He is building the official version before anyone else can get traction with the truth. By the time any of this reaches a real investigation, your account becomes the one that contradicts established facts rather than the other way around." William added, his handwriting tight with barely contained anger. "Scroll down." She did. Near the bottom of the article, a brief quote attributed to an unnamed witness at the scene described details that bore only passing resemblance to what Linda had actually observed, details that, if accepted as factual, would make any future account she offered sound confused, contradicted, unreliable. They had built a case against her memory before she had said anything publicly at all. Linda grabbed the notepad and pressed down hard. "They are discrediting me preemptively. They know exactly who I am and what I saw, and they are making sure it will not matter before I even have the chance to say it out loud." Waylon nodded. "Stone needs to hear all of this. But first, we need to talk about what William found overnight." William straightened and pulled a second file from his bag. His expression had shifted from angry to the focused, methodical look of someone presenting findings he had spent hours verifying before committing to share them. He wrote, "I spent the night tracing the shell company that registered the truck. It does not dead end in Nogales the way I said last night. That was just the first layer. I kept going. He pulled a diagram from the folder drawn by hand, layers of corporate entities connected by handwritten lines with dates and account numbers noted in his compact script. He set it on the table so Linda could follow along as he wrote. The truck was registered to a shell that traces through two more shells to a holding entity registered in Delaware. That entity has two notable connections. First, it holds a financial stake in a private security firm called Hogan Security Partners. Second, Hogan Security Partners holds active contracts with the Maricopa County Sheriff's Department, the Pinal County Sheriff's Department, and with a hospital administration consulting firm called Summit Risk Management. He paused. Let her read that, then continued. Summit Risk Management provides staffing and security consultation services to Verde Valley Medical Center, the hospital where you and Stone were both admitted. The room went very quiet. Linda read the paragraph 3 times, then looked up at William, then at Waylon, then back at the diagram with its neat, damning lines connecting a truck on a desert highway to the hospital room where someone had walked in with a syringe at 6 in the morning. She wrote, they did not just get lucky with a fake badge, they had infrastructure inside that hospital before we ever arrived. William nodded, which means whoever sits at the top of this structure has been building it for years. This is not a cartel paying off one local detective. This is something that was designed with institutional reach from the beginning. Waylon took the notepad. His handwriting was harder than William's, more physical. The man who runs Hogan Security Partners is named Dennis Hogan, real estate developer, sits on the county civilian oversight board that approved Blackwood's last promotion, major donor to the sheriff's re-election campaign. On paper, he is a respected businessman. In practice, based on what William has built out overnight, he is the reason this operation has survived this long without anyone looking at it from the right angle. Linda felt the ground shift beneath her understanding of the situation. She had survived an explosion on a highway and 2 attempts on her life in a hospital, and she had assumed, in the way people assume things when they were running on adrenaline and shock, that the threat was localized. A cartel, pushing through territory. A dirty cop, dangerous but bounded. This was not bounded. This had been constructed across years inside the systems that were supposed to provide accountability by a man who understood exactly how to make himself look like part of the solution. She wrote, what do we do with this? William answered immediately. I send it to Carol Weaver, FBI contact. Clean line, completely separate from any jurisdiction connected to Blackwood or Hogan. I have been in contact with her agent since last night. She has been developing independent leads on financial irregularities in this region for months. What we have built gives her the connection she has been missing. Waylon added, and we move Stone as soon as he is stable enough. We cannot leave him in that hospital, knowing what we now know about Summit Risk Management's relationship with that building. The convoy that assembled within the hour was larger than the one that had brought Linda here the previous night. More vehicles, more motorcycles, a controlled urgency in the way people moved through the compound as Waylon coordinated on his phone. May appeared at Linda's shoulder and wrote briefly, you are staying here. It is not safe for you to go back near that building. Linda shook her head immediately and reached for May's pen. No, Stone got hurt because of what he did on that highway. I am not sitting safe in the mountains while everyone else carries the weight of protecting him. May studied her for a long moment. Something moved across her weathered face, deliberation and then a reluctant, genuine respect that Linda was beginning to recognize as something that had to be earned in this community rather than given. She wrote finally, you are going to get along fine here. Stone is going to like you very much. The drive back down the mountain felt faster and tighter than the trip up had been. Waylon sat beside Linda in the lead SUV with one hand resting near the door, his eyes moving constantly between the road ahead and the mirrors behind. They arrived at the hospital's rear entrance to find a scene already in motion. 2 men in dark suits were engaged in an argument with hospital security at the main entrance, gesturing at a clipboard, their body language radiating the aggressive impatience of people performing authority they did not actually have. William, from the front seat, had his phone raised, zoomed in on the entrance from the parking area. He turned back to Linda and wrote quickly, "I recognize one of them from a filing I pulled last night. That is Hogan's security chief. They are stalling the front entrance to buy time for someone approaching from a different direction." Before Linda could fully absorb that Waylon was already opening his door, relaying something to the rest of the convoy through his phone, and the vehicles around them were repositioning with the smooth, practiced coordination of people who had done this before. They entered through a side door, took the stairs rather than the elevator, emerged onto Stone's floor, and found the two club members who had been stationed outside Stone's door pressed against the wall by hospital security guards who had clearly been summoned by a false alarm, their hands up, their expressions furious. Linda understood within seconds. Someone had called in a fabricated disturbance on this floor at exactly the moment it mattered most. Stone's actual protection pulled away from his door by the building's own security infrastructure that had been compromised before any of them had arrived. Waylon did not stop to argue with anyone. He moved down the hallway at a pace that was nearly running, and Linda stayed with him, her ribs screaming at each impact of her feet against the floor. They reached Stone's room. A man in hospital scrubs had his hand on the IV line feeding into Stone's arm, uncapped syringe in the other hand. Stone, exhausted and bandaged and barely able to lift his arms, had one hand locked around the man's wrist, holding him in place through sheer stubborn refusal to stop. Even flat on his back in a hospital bed, he was not done. Waylon hit the intruder like a freight train, and they crashed into the monitoring equipment beside the bed. Machines toppled. Alarms Linda could not hear flashed red across every screen in the room. The syringe skittered across the floor. Linda lunged forward and drove her heel down on it, shattering the barrel before it could be recovered. The intruder reached beneath his scrubs. Waylon was faster, hitting him once across the jaw with a precision that buckled him, and a second time as he tried to rise. The man went down and stayed down. Real nurses flooded the room. Stone, strained and gray-faced with the effort of the last 2 minutes, pushed himself up against his pillows and found Linda across the chaos of the room. His eyes locked onto her face. His mouth moved. She read it without needing anyone to translate. "You are okay." Linda nodded, fast tears blurring her vision, and crossed to his bedside through the shouting and the movement of the medical staff working to restore order around them, gripping his hand, the same hand that had just held a killer's wrist through sheer will, holding on as though it were the only solid thing left in the room. Security dragged the intruder out. Federal agents arrived within the hour, Carol Weaver among them, her badge federal, and her bearing carrying the kind of quiet authority that comes from not needing to make noise about it. She surveyed the scene with practiced efficiency and then turned directly to Linda and wrote on a notepad she had already prepared, "Miss Armstrong, I am Special Agent Carol Weaver. I received the materials your associate sent last night. As of an hour ago, this investigation is officially federal. Detective Blackwood has been placed on administrative leave pending full review. I want you to know that what you witnessed on that highway and everything that has happened since is being taken seriously at the appropriate level." Linda read it twice, then wrote back, "Is it over? Are we safe now?" Weaver's expression carried an honesty Linda found she trusted precisely because it was not reassuring. "Not yet. Whoever funds this operation still has resources we have not fully mapped, but you are not fighting this alone anymore. That is what changes today." The move from the hospital to the compound happened that evening, this time under federal escort, in addition to the club's own vehicles, a combination that would have seemed impossible to imagine 48 hours earlier. Stone was stable enough to move, and he made clear in terms that left no room for interpretation that he was moving whether his medical team approved or not. On the road back up into the mountains, Linda watched the desert slide past in the darkening light and held the knowledge of what William had found like something heavy and carefully balanced. Hogan security, Summit risk management, contracts threaded through law enforcement and hospital administration, and a network of shell entities designed to make the whole structure invisible until someone started from the right angle and pulled. Dennis Hogan had built himself into the machinery of accountability on purpose, using his position on civilian oversight boards and his donations to the campaigns of elected officials to make himself look like part of the solution while quietly protecting an operation that had been running product through this region for years. The Iron Desert MC had not been targeted because they were powerful. They had been targeted because Stone Decker's territory intersected with the route Hogan needed, and Stone had refused to become part of the infrastructure. May was waiting at the compound entrance when the convoy arrived, and she pulled Linda into a brief, fierce embrace that startled her before she sank into it. When May pulled back, she wrote one word, "Good." Later that night, Linda found Stone on the small covered porch outside his quarters. Someone had brought him outside in a wheelchair, and he sat looking out at the dark shapes of the mountains with an expression she could not fully read in the dim light. He noticed her approach immediately and gestured toward the empty chair beside him. They sat for a while without writing anything, just two people on a porch in the mountains, the desert quiet pressing around them, the stars overhead, enormous in the way they were only enormous when you were far enough from anything that called itself a city. Eventually, Stone picked up the small notepad tucked into the side pocket of his wheelchair and wrote, "Can I ask you something personal?" Linda nodded. He wrote, "Why did you really run toward that fire? Everyone says it was because it was the right thing to do. I do not think that is the complete answer. I have been around long enough to recognize when there is more underneath." Linda considered the question for longer than she usually considered questions. Then she wrote slowly, choosing each word with more care than she usually bothered with. "My whole life, people have decided what I am capable of before I get a chance to find out for myself. Deaf girl, must be fragile, must need help, cannot be trusted with anything that actually matters. I have spent 22 years proving those assumptions wrong, and it never seems to stay proved because the next person just starts from the same place again." She paused, then continued, "When I saw that truck hit your riders, when I saw everyone else just standing there frozen, I was not thinking about danger. I was thinking about every single time someone should have moved and did not. Every time I stood at a counter waiting to be noticed. Every time a doctor looked past me to explain my own diagnosis to someone who could hear. I was not going to be one more person standing still." Stone read this slowly. His expression shifted through several things she could not fully name before settling into something quiet and moved. He wrote back, "I lost my wife 11 years ago. A car accident on an ordinary road on an ordinary day. I watched people freeze, watched them stand at the edges with their phones out while I tried to get her out of the car, and nobody came fast enough. By the time anyone moved, it was too late." Linda's chest tightened. He continued, "When I saw you running toward that fire, when I saw everyone else standing still exactly the way they stood still that day, something inside me that I thought had calcified years ago broke wide open. You did what nobody did for her. I know the situations are not the same. I know you did not do it for me or for her memory, but I need you to understand what it means, what it still means." Linda reached out and covered his large, weathered hand with her smaller one. For a long moment, they sat like that in the mountain dark, not writing anything, not needing to. Then May appeared at the door behind them, her expression carrying the gravity of someone bringing news that could not wait for a better moment. She held out a folded piece of paper. "William sent this up," he said immediately. Stone took it, read it, passed it to Linda without a word, his jaw set. Linda read what William had discovered, cross-referencing additional ownership records. The consulting firm connected to Hogan Security that manages Verde, Valley Medical Center's staffing contracts is also connected through a holding company registered in Delaware to a federal facilities management company. That federal company holds a facilities contract with a federal office building in Phoenix, the building Carol Weaver uses as her field office. Hogan does not just have reach into local law enforcement and hospital administration. He may have infrastructure adjacent to the very federal building Weaver has proposed as a meeting location. Someone in or near Weaver's direct operation may have access to information that is being channeled back to Hogan's network. Linda looked up at Stone. He was already writing his expression, the focused cold of a man who had been making decisions in dangerous terrain for 3 decades. We cannot go to that building without independent verification of Weaver's team, and we need to move faster than they can adjust. Whatever Hogan knows, he knows because someone is still feeding it to him. We have to close that channel before it closes us. Outside the compound's perimeter fence, the desert stretched dark and enormous in every direction, safe for now in a way that felt increasingly provisional. The war was not over. It had not even found its shape yet, but Linda sat with Stone's steady presence beside her and William's document in her hands, and she felt something that was not quite fear and not quite certainty, but somewhere between the two. She had run into fire once. She was capable of running into fire again. Whatever was coming next, she would face it with her eyes open. That was the only way she knew. The morning after William's discovery came in cold and clear, the mountain air carrying a bite that the desert floor below them would not feel for another 2 months. Linda found the compound already alert and moving, the early quiet disrupted by the particular focused energy of people who had spent the night working through a problem and arrived at a decision. William had not slept. She could tell from the depth of the shadows under his eyes and the way he was running on the particular precise urgency that comes when someone has been awake long enough that their body has given up arguing with their mind. He had 3 printed documents spread across the kitchen table and a 4th document loading on his screen when Linda came in. He signed when he saw her, a greeting that had become more natural across the last day, the signs coming faster and with less visible effort than they had when she first met him. Then he switched to writing. I confirmed what I found last night. The Federal Facilities Company, connected to Hogan's network, does not have access to Weaver's case files. That is not the exposure. The exposure is simpler. The contractor who manages building access for Weaver's field office went through a competitive bid process that Hogan's security partners was involved in as a subcontractor. One of Hogan's former employees is currently the access administrator for that building. He cannot see case files, but he can see who goes in and out, and when. Linda read it, then wrote, which means if Weaver scheduled a meeting at that building and told her team about it, and one person on her team mentioned it in a conversation near that building, Hogan would know. William nodded. Not the full picture, but enough. Enough to position people at the parking structure. Enough to send a message to Linda's phone. Enough to know that their window was closing and to escalate. Waylon came in from outside while Linda and William were still at the table, shaking cold air from his shoulders, and wrote briefly before pouring himself coffee, Stone wants to meet. All 4 of us. Main room. He has been awake since 4. Stone was in the main room in his wheelchair, positioned near the window that looked out toward the compound entrance. He had the whiteboard on his lap and the expression of a man who had made a decision in the night and was ready to explain it. When Linda and William and Waylon had settled into seats around him, he began writing. We have enough to give Weaver what she needs to move. The question is how we deliver it, so Hogan cannot see it coming. William sends nothing through any digital channel connected to this compound or to any of our phones. We drive the documentation physically to a location Weaver names that is not her field office and not any location she has mentioned to her team in writing, in person, paper. William nodded, already anticipating this. I called her from a borrowed phone this morning. a number that does not exist in any database connected to any of us. She agreed to a location she named verbally over the phone with no digital record. She is as concerned about the channel integrity as we are. Linda wrote, when? Stone today. The drive to Phoenix took just under 2 hours through mountain terrain that Linda was beginning to feel familiar with, in the particular way you feel familiar with a route you have driven under stress, each landmark carrying the memory of the circumstances that first introduced it. The convoy was smaller this time, 4 vehicles chosen for low visibility rather than numbers. Weaver was waiting at a location that turned out to be a private conference room in a law firm where one of her agency's legal contacts worked 3 floors above a street in a part of Phoenix that had nothing to do with any federal building or law enforcement facility. She was sitting at the head of the table when they were brought in, and she rose when Stone's wheelchair came through the door. She looked at Linda first, then wrote, what you have sent and what you have survived in the past 72 hours is remarkable. I want you to know that I mean that without any condescension. What you witnessed on that highway and what you have done since is material to the largest financial corruption investigation this region has seen in 15 years. Linda read it and wrote back, tell me what you need. Weaver outlined the situation with a clarity that Linda appreciated. The financial evidence William had assembled was strong but circumstantial, without a direct human connection between Hogan and the violent elements of the operation. Esteban Ruiz, the man Wayland had subdued during the assault on Stone's hospital room, was currently in federal custody and had indicated through his attorney a willingness to cooperate in exchange for sentencing consideration. If Ruiz would confirm the connection between Hogan's infrastructure and the cartel operation on record, combined with the financial trail and Linda's eyewitness account of the highway attack, it would be enough to move on Hogan simultaneously with the cartel figures already under surveillance. Linda wrote, when do you need my formal statement? Weaver, today, if possible. Here, this room, with an interpreter I have already arranged who was vetted independently of any channel connected to Hogan. The formal statements took nearly 3 hours. Linda signed and the interpreter translated into the record while a federal stenographer documented every word. She walked through everything, the box truck's pacing, the deliberate turn, the fire, the engine block, the moment she had thrown herself over Stone's body before the explosion. Every detail she had been carrying in the careful, precise memory she had developed across a lifetime of reading the world without sound. When it was finished, Weaver looked at Linda across the table with an expression that was professional and something more. She wrote, thank you. This is the piece that makes everything else irrefutable. Then she looked at Stone and wrote, we move tonight. Simultaneous arrests across 7 locations. I am not giving Hogan's network the time to respond. Stone read it and nodded once, then wrote, we want to be present at the compound when you execute. I am not going to wait in a hotel room. Weaver looked at him for a long moment, then wrote back, that is not standard protocol. Stone wrote, I am not a standard situation. Weaver allowed herself a brief, dry expression that was almost a smile. No, you are not. Agreed. Federal agents will be present at the compound during the operation. Your people stay inside the perimeter unless instructed otherwise. They drove back up into the mountains with the particular weighted quiet of people who know that the hours ahead of them are the most consequential of an already consequential stretch of days. The sun was dropping behind the mountains by the time the compound came into view, and the moment the vehicles came through the gate, Linda could feel the change in the air, a tight, focused alertness that had settled over every person inside the perimeter. May met Linda at the door and walked her inside without a word, understanding something from Linda's expression that neither of them needed to write down. The night hours moved slowly. Federal agents had taken up positions around the compound's perimeter while Weaver coordinated with her team remotely, the operation unfolding across multiple locations simultaneously. in a choreography that Linda could only follow in fragments through what William was able to relay and what she could piece together from the controlled urgency moving through the faces around her. At some point close to 2 in the morning, the lights in the compound's main building flickered once and then died completely. Emergency lighting came on a few seconds later, casting everything in a dim red glow. Linda felt Waylon's hand close around her arm, immediately pulling her low, positioning his body between her and the door. Through the small window beside the entrance, Linda caught movement in the compound yard, shapes moving fast and coordinated, club members converging on something at the perimeter fence while federal agents shifted positions. Her hands tightened on the chair arm as she tracked what she could see through the glass, the silent version of a confrontation that she understood was loud and violent on the other side of the wall. Stone beside her reached out and covered her hand. She looked at him. He mouthed slowly and deliberately, making sure she read every syllable, "You are safe." She did not fully believe it, but she held on to it anyway. The confrontation at the perimeter lasted less than 15 minutes. 3 men who had attempted to breach the compound fence, apparently timed to coincide with the power disruption. All 3 were in federal custody before the emergency lighting was replaced by the regular lights coming back on. When Waylon straightened and the tension in his shoulders finally eased, he took the whiteboard and wrote, "Threat neutralized, 3 in custody, nobody hurt. Breathe." Linda breathed, and then barely 40 minutes later, Weaver appeared in the compound's main room with her phone in her hand and an expression that finally, for the first time in days, carried something Linda had almost given up expecting: relief. She wrote it out for the room, standing in the center of the space surrounded by people in leather vests and federal agents who had spent the last several hours in an uneasy but functional alliance. Hogan is in custody. Blackwood is in custody. 7 additional arrests across 4 locations. Ruiz confirmed the connection to Hogan on record an hour ago. The operation is down. The silence that followed lasted exactly 1 beat. Then the room went loud in a way that Linda could feel through the floor and through the walls and through the hands of the people around her, who grabbed each other's arms and shoulders with the particular release of people who have been holding their breath for days. Stone, sitting beside Linda, did not move for a long moment. He looked at her, then he looked at the whiteboard and wrote slowly, as though the words needed to be said carefully to be real. "It is over." Linda read the words, read them again, and then something in her chest that had been clenched since that afternoon she had thrown open her car door and run toward a burning highway finally carefully began to let go. Outside the compound's perimeter, the desert night was enormous and quiet. The same desert, the same silence she had always carried with her. But tonight, inside that silence, something felt different. Not safer exactly, more complete, like a sentence that had been unfinished for years had finally been written through to its last word. She was tired. She was bruised. She was sitting in a building on a mountain, in the dark, surrounded by people she had not known 3 days ago and could not now imagine facing any of this without. She wrote on the whiteboard 1 line and pushed it across to Stone. "What happens now?" He read it. And, despite everything, despite the exhaustion written across every line of his face and the bandages still wrapped around his torso, and the 3 days of violence and fear that sat between them, and anything resembling ordinary life, something in his expression opened up. He wrote back, "Now we take care of you." The days that followed the arrests moved with the strange disorienting texture of aftermath, that particular phase after a crisis where the adrenaline has finally drained and the body is left trying to remember what normal felt like before it was replaced by something else entirely. Federal agents maintained a presence at the compound for the first 4 days, coordinating with Waylon and William on the documentation trail and conducting follow-up interviews with members of the club who had witnessed various elements of the attack on the highway and the subsequent events. Carol Weaver came in person twice and both times she sat with Linda at the kitchen table for hours, working through the formal case documentation with a thoroughness that Linda found exhausting and necessary in equal measure. Blackwood's attorney was already building a defense based on entrapment and insufficient evidence for the financial records. Hogan's legal team was more sophisticated and more aggressive, deploying the kind of high-priced institutional machinery that the clients of private security contractors apparently had access to. Weaver was honest about what that meant. The case would hold, she was confident of that, but it would take time, and Linda's testimony would remain critical at trial. Linda absorbed this information and filed it in the part of her mind where she put things she could not resolve immediately but needed to keep visible. Then she set it aside and paid attention to the thing that was not waiting. Her leg had gotten worse. She had noticed it first during the evacuation from the hospital, the right leg dragging more than it had in months, the balance worse than it had been even the week before. She had attributed it to stress and physical trauma, which her physician in Scottsdale had confirmed were indeed significant exacerbating factors for her condition. But when Catherine Dixon, her physical therapist, drove up to the compound for a session 3 days after the arrest, the assessment was less comfortable than Linda had hoped. Catherine sat across from her and wrote with the careful directness Linda had always valued in her. Your condition has progressed during this period of acute stress and physical injury. The nerve function assessments we ran this morning are showing markers that are moving in the direction we discussed 6 months ago as the threshold for surgical urgency. Without intervention soon, we are looking at permanent mobility loss in the right leg within the next 4 to 6 months, potentially both legs beyond that. Linda read it sitting in a chair by the window in the room May had given her, with the vibrating alarm still on the nightstand and the photographs she had finally had time to look at in the hallway outside, images of people she did not know yet but was beginning to understand. She read Catherine's notes and then folded the paper carefully and set it on the windowsill. $150,000, $11,000 in savings. The arithmetic had not changed. The timeline had. She did not tell Stone immediately. She was not sure why. Perhaps because the last several days had already cost everyone around her so much, and it felt wrong to arrive at the end of that with a new weight in her hands before anyone had even had a chance to breathe. Perhaps because she needed to sit with it herself first, the way she had always needed to sit with difficult things in the quiet before she could figure out what to do with them. But Stone noticed. He noticed in the way he had noticed most things about her over the past several days, by watching her face and reading what her eyes were doing, even when her hands were still. He asked her that evening on the porch, in the direct, uncomplicated way that she was beginning to understand was simply how he operated. He wrote, "What is it not the case? Something else." Linda thought about deflecting, decided against it. She took the notepad and explained the surgery, the cost, the timeline, the gap between her savings, and what the procedure actually required. She wrote it out without drama, the way she had learned to explain her situation to people who needed to understand it functionally rather than emotionally. Stone read every word. His expression when he looked up from the last line was unreadable for a moment in a way that made Linda's stomach tighten. Then he wrote with a certainty that carried no trace of impulse or sympathy, but a great deal of something else entirely. "Give me a week." Linda looked at him. He looked back. She wrote, "Stone, this is $150,000. He wrote, "I know the number. Give me a week." She did not fully understand what he intended, and she was too tired to press for specifics. She suspected he would not provide anyway. She simply nodded, and she went back inside and told herself she would not think about it until morning. Across the next 7 days, the compound shifted in a way she could feel but not entirely explain. Conversations that stopped when she entered rooms, Waylon and William disappearing for stretches and returning with the contained energy of people who had been busy with something they were not yet ready to discuss. May, moving through the kitchen with an efficiency that suggested she was preparing for a large gathering rather than the current population of the compound. Stone himself spent long hours on the phone, sitting in his usual spot near the window, with his expression carrying the focused patience of a man methodically calling in the kind of debts that accumulate across 30 years of leading a life in which people owe you things. One morning, Linda came out to find 4 motorcycles she did not recognize parked by the main building, their riders already inside, talking to Stone with the easy familiarity of old friends. The next morning, there were 11 bikes she did not recognize. The morning after that, when she walked out toward the main yard, she stopped at the edge of the covered walkway and simply stared. The compound was full, riders from chapters she did not recognize, patches she could not read from this distance, men and women who had clearly come from considerable distances based on the road dust on their clothes and the slightly stiff way they were moving after long hours on a motorcycle. Dozens of them moving through the compound with the directed energy of people who had arrived with a purpose. May appeared at Linda's shoulder and wrote on the notepad she kept in her pocket. Stone called in 30 years of loyalty this morning. Every chapter that owes him something, every person who remembers what he has done for them. They were all asked the same question. Linda signed, "What question?" May wrote, and this time the expression on her face held a warmth that Linda had not seen her wear at full intensity before. Whether family means something, or whether it is just something you put on a patch and wear on your back. On the morning of the 7th day, Stone found Linda on the porch before she had finished her coffee and sat down beside her with the particular expression he wore when he had finished thinking about something and was ready to explain. He wrote, "We are going to Los Angeles today. All of us, every person you see in that yard. We are going to the hospital where your specialist works, and we are paying for your surgery in full. Today." Linda stared at the words, read them again, then looked out at the yard full of motorcycles and riders and back at Stone. She signed, her hands shaking. "How, Stone? I know what that costs. I have done the math every day for 2 years." He wrote back, and there was no drama in it, just the same quiet, absolute certainty that had characterized everything he had said to her since the moment she had knelt beside him on that burning highway. 30 years of loyalty adds up to more than you might think. Every man and woman in that yard owes me something, whether that is money or a favor or simply the fact that I never once turned my back on family when it mattered. Today, I am calling in every bit of it, not for myself, for you, because you ran into fire for a stranger without hesitating for 1 second. And every person out there understands exactly what that kind of courage costs. Linda read the words until her vision blurred. She pressed her hand over her mouth and looked away at the mountains, at the enormous Arizona sky, at the compound full of people who had driven from multiple states to be here for someone they had never met because the man who led them had asked them to. She thought about the surgeon's notes, about Catherine's carefully written assessment, about the $11,000 and the impossible gap. She looked back at Stone. He was watching her with an expression that held everything: patience, fierceness, something that had been growing steadily across the past 7 days into something she did not yet have the right word for, but recognized with a completeness that surprised her. She signed, "I do not know how to accept this." He wrote, "You do not have to know how. You just have to get in the vehicle." She got in the vehicle. The convoy that assembled outside the compound that morning stretched longer than anything Linda had seen since she had arrived here. She stood at the edge of the covered walkway and watched it come together, watched riders she had never met checking tire pressure and adjusting gear with the calm efficiency of people who had done this 100 times before, and she felt something move through her chest that she did not try to name because she was afraid that naming it would make it smaller than it was. May appeared at her shoulder and touched her arm gently. She wrote, How are you feeling? Linda wrote back honestly, like someone is about to do something impossibly kind for me, and I do not have any idea how to hold that. May put the notepad away and simply hugged her instead, brief and fierce, the kind of embrace that does not need to be explained. Waylon organized the convoy with the quiet, precise authority that Linda had come to understand was simply how he moved through the world. Motorcycles in formation at the front and rear, vehicles in the center, a single clear radio protocol that she could follow in fragments by watching the way people responded rather than by hearing any of it. Stone rode in the lead SUV, still not cleared for his motorcycle due to his injuries, but managing his impatience about this with better grace than Linda would have expected. She rode with him in the back seat, and neither of them wrote much during the drive. There was something between them by now that existed in the space between conversations, a kind of mutual recognition that did not require constant maintenance through words. She looked out the window at the highway, unscrolling beneath them, and thought about the last time she had driven a stretch of Arizona highway and where it had led. The convoy hit the Los Angeles area in the early afternoon, and the sight of what amounted to nearly 100 motorcycles riding in disciplined formation through suburban streets drew the kind of attention that required no explanation. People stopped on sidewalks. Cars edged over instinctively. Phones came out. Linda watched it all through the window and felt for a moment the strange, disorienting sensation of being inside something that would look from the outside like a spectacle and felt from the inside like something much more quiet and much more personal. The private medical center where Linda's specialist worked was a clean, orderly building in a quiet part of the city, the kind of facility whose professionalism expressed itself in calm tones and unhurried lobbies. The sight of the motorcycles filling the surrounding streets, the riders dismounting in unison, their engines cutting to silence in a single rolling wave that Linda could feel through the ground before the stillness settled, drew the immediate and visible attention of the building's security personnel and the front desk staff. Stone led a small group inside, himself, Waylon, William, May, and Linda, along with two men she had not spent much time with yet, who she learned had spent the past week working with Stone's attorney to prepare the financial arrangements with the precision of people who wanted no mistakes in the execution. The hospital administrator who met them was polished and cautious. She looked at Stone and at his leather vest and at the crowd of bikers visible through the lobby windows and managed to keep her expression entirely professional while clearly recalibrating her understanding of the situation in real time. One of the two men Linda did not know yet set a folder on the administrator's desk. Inside was a cashier's check and a set of legal documents that had been prepared by Stone's attorney across the previous week. The administrator opened the folder. Her expression went through several careful shifts. She looked up at Stone, said something that Linda could not fully read, but understood from his expression and the administrator's face to be a question about the nature of the arrangement. Waylon translated the administrator's response for Linda afterward. She asked who the funds were from. Stone had answered family. The administrator processed everything with a thoroughness that probably reflected both genuine professionalism and the institutional instinct to be very careful when an unusual situation presented itself. Linda's specialist was reached by phone, agreed to come in for a consultation that afternoon, and arrived 40 minutes later with an expression that shifted from curious to understanding to genuinely moved across the course of a conversation that Linda could only follow in part through the notes passed back and forth and the expressions of the people in the room. The specialist, a precise woman with short gray hair who communicated with Linda directly and in writing without being asked, confirmed what Catherine had assessed. The surgery was necessary and the window for optimal outcome was narrowing. She looked at the financial documentation, then she looked at Stone, then she looked at Linda. She wrote, "We can schedule this for the day after tomorrow if you are ready." Linda looked at Stone. He looked at her. He wrote one word, ready. Linda thought about the highway, about the engine block and the pipe and the fire, and the choice she had made that afternoon that had led through a chain of events too strange and too consequential to have been predicted to this room, to this moment. She wrote back yes. She was ready. The day before the surgery, Linda sat with Stone in the garden outside the medical facility, which had agreed to provide a suite for her pre-operative preparation and for Stone's continued recovery, neither of them going back to Arizona until after the procedure. The garden was small and carefully maintained with the slightly artificial quality of a garden designed for people in difficult circumstances, attempting to offer peace without demanding it. Stone wrote, "Are you afraid?" Linda wrote back, "Yes." "Are you?" Stone, "Every time I have ever done something worth doing, yes." They sat quietly after that. Waylon came and went. May sat with Linda for an hour in the afternoon, doing nothing in particular, but being present in a way that Linda had spent so much of her life without, that she still was not entirely sure how to accept it without bracing for its withdrawal. William found her in the early evening with his laptop and showed her something that he had been monitoring across the past several days. Trial proceedings for Dennis Hogan had been formally scheduled. Blackwood had agreed to a cooperation deal that would, according to Weaver's most recent communication, significantly accelerate the federal case timeline. Esteban Ruiz had provided enough documented detail about the operation structure to render Hogan's legal defenses substantially less viable than his attorneys had originally projected. William wrote beneath the summary, "It is holding. The case is solid. They are not going to walk away from this." Linda read it, then wrote good. She meant it without qualification, not because the case resolved everything, not because the trial and its aftermath would not require more of her time and energy and exposure than she would prefer, but because it meant that the thing she had witnessed on that highway, the deliberate, calculated violence of it, would not be successfully rewritten into something else. The truth would have a record. The surgery took 7 hours. Linda went under in the early morning with Stone's face, the last thing she saw clearly, standing in the doorway of the pre-operative room with his hand raised, once simply present, simply there. The anesthesia came in fast, and the white silence that followed felt different from the ordinary silence of her life. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of everything, a complete rest that she had not realized until she was inside it how badly she had needed. She woke to recovery room brightness and the familiar disorientation of consciousness reconstructing itself from scattered pieces. Her hands moved before her eyes were fully open, old reflex reaching for her language, even before she was sure of where she was. A nurse noticed and bent into her line of sight, immediately kind and deliberate. She held up a small whiteboard already prepared. "Surgery successful. Everything went as expected. You are in recovery. You are safe." Linda read it, closed her eyes, opened them again. Stone was not in the room yet, but May was sitting in a chair beside the bed with her hands in her lap and an expression of such open, uncomplicated relief that Linda felt something loosen in her chest that had been knotted there since she had woken up in Verde Valley Medical Center 6 days ago. May wrote, "He is in the waiting room. He has been there since 5 this morning. They would not let him in during recovery. He is not happy about it." Linda felt the corner of her mouth shift upward. She wrote, "Tell him I am okay." May wrote, "He already knows. I texted him the moment you opened your eyes. He replied in about 4 seconds. The recovery that followed was neither fast nor easy, because nothing genuinely worth recovering from is. Physical therapy began 3 days after surgery. Catherine flying in to coordinate with the specialist team on a protocol, and the first sessions were humbling in the way that genuine physical rehabilitation is always humbling. The gap between where you are and where you need to be made visible in small, exhausting detail. But the markers were right. The nerve response was responding, the way the surgeon had predicted it would respond with the surgical intervention in place. The dragging in the right leg, the thing that had been getting steadily worse across 2 years of carefully documented progression, began gradually week by week to ease. They stayed in Los Angeles for 3 weeks. The medical center provided accommodation. The club members who had ridden down for the surgery rotated through visits, a steady, low-key presence that Linda found herself gradually adjusting to the way you adjust to something that is good for you, but that you did not previously understand you were allowed to have. William came twice and spent hours with Linda going over the federal case timeline and the specific elements of her testimony that were being prepared for trial. Stone was there every day. They had long conversations across those weeks, conducted entirely on paper and whiteboard, and the increasingly fluent sign language that Stone was investing real time and effort into learning with the focused, methodical persistence that she was beginning to understand characterized everything he took seriously. His hands were large and his early signs were clumsy, and he made the same mistakes repeatedly before correcting them, and sometimes looked at Linda's face for confirmation with a vulnerability that she found completely at odds with everything else about him and completely endearing. She taught him the signs for things she thought he should know first. Safety. I understand. Are you okay? Not alone. Thank you. Family. He practiced them with the seriousness of someone who understood they were not just vocabulary, but a way of being present in her world instead of asking her to be entirely present in his. It was during the 3rd week sitting together in the garden, in the California afternoon warmth, that Stone wrote something he had apparently been thinking about for longer than this conversation. He wrote, I want to say something, and I want to say it right, so I am going to take longer than usual with the writing. Linda waited. He wrote, I have known a lot of people in my life who were brave. I have known people who did brave things because they had to, because there was no other option, because backing down was worse than going forward. What you did on that highway was not like that. You had a choice, a clear, complete choice. Nobody would have judged you for staying at the edge of the road. Nobody would have thought less of you. The entire world around you had made the same choice, and they looked at you like you were the strange one for not making it. He paused in his writing, then continued, I want to know you better. I want that to be something we decide to do together deliberately, with full understanding of what each of our lives looks like. I am not asking for anything today. I am telling you something I want so that you have it in your hands and you can do whatever you want with it. Linda read the words several times. She looked at the garden, at the careful way the afternoon light was moving through the leaves of a small, ornamental tree near the wall, at Stone's face, which held no expectation and no pressure, only the particular steady openness of someone who was genuinely prepared to hear whatever answer came back. She wrote, I think I want that too. I think I have been thinking about that since about the 3rd day, but I also do not know what your life looks like from the inside yet, and I need you to understand that mine has a lot of appointments and legal proceedings and physical therapy sessions and a court date somewhere on the horizon that is going to be uncomfortable. Stone wrote, I have 30 years of complicated. I am not going anywhere. Linda wrote, neither am I. They returned to the compound in the 3rd week of November, driving up through the mountain terrain as the desert below began its subtle shift toward the particular quality of winter in the southwest, the light thinner and clearer, the shadows longer in the afternoon. The compound welcomed them back with the ordinary, unremarkable warmth of people who had been waiting for someone to come home, which Linda understood riding up the familiar gravel road was exactly what it was. May had prepared food. Waylon had somehow found time between his other responsibilities to locate the particular type of vibrating alarm system that Linda had been using and install a second one in Stone's quarters, as well as the guest room, without anyone asking him to. William had pinned a printed summary of the federal case timeline to the kitchen bulletin board with the methodical efficiency of someone who understood that keeping people informed was a form of respect. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that Linda had not had in her life before, not quite ordinary, but structured in a way that allowed for something like it. Physical therapy 3 times a week, Catherine making the drive up to the compound for the first month, and then transitioning Linda to a clinic in Payson that was closer, legal consultations with Weaver's team about the trial, which was scheduled for the following spring, long evenings in the main building where she was gradually, without anyone making a formal announcement of it, included in the ongoing life of the community, rather than treated as a temporary resident. She began to know people, not the abstract version of knowing people that came from seeing the same faces repeatedly in the same place, but the real version, the version where you know that a specific person takes their coffee in a specific way and has a specific complicated relationship with a specific topic and will laugh at a specific kind of joke. She learned that Waylon had a daughter in college who was studying environmental law, that William had been considering going back to school himself and kept not doing it for reasons he acknowledged were not very good reasons, that May had opinions about pie, strong and specific opinions that she held with remarkable conviction. She learned Stone in the way you learn someone when you spend real time with them without the immediate pressure of crisis forcing every interaction to be about survival. He was quieter than she had expected. He read more than anyone she knew. He had a specific complicated relationship with forgiveness that he worked through in a way that was private but not hidden. He was occasionally unreasonably stubborn and consistently, surprisingly funny in a dry, understated way that rewarded paying close attention. He was learning to sign. He was by December considerably better at it than he had any right to be for someone who had started from nothing in October, which she attributed to the same relentless, methodical persistence he applied to everything he decided deserved his full attention. She began teaching him things she had never taught anyone before, not just vocabulary, but the particular logic of a language that operated on a different architecture than spoken English, the way it handled space and time and nuance through dimensions that hearing people spent their whole lives not having to think about. He approached it the way he apparently approached everything worth doing, with patience and seriousness and the willingness to be wrong repeatedly on the way to getting it right. Christmas came and went with a celebration at the compound that was louder and warmer than anything Linda had experienced in years. The holiday expanded by the size of the community and the particular relief of people who had been through something hard together and were glad to be on the other side of it. Linda spent Christmas morning with May in the kitchen and Christmas afternoon in the main room with more people than she could comfortably count, and went to bed that night with the specific unfamiliar exhaustion of someone who has been genuinely thoroughly included. The new year arrived cold and clear. Stone found her on the porch on New Year's morning in the blue pre-dawn light, both of them holding coffee mugs, looking out at the mountains in the particular quiet of a new beginning that did not require a ceremony to feel significant. He signed slowly and carefully, making sure each movement was right. "How is your leg?" She signed back, "Better every week." He signed, "Good." They stood together in the cold dawn quiet. The mountains enormous and indifferent and very beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they have no interest in being observed, when they simply are what they are, in the dark and the light in equal measure. Linda thought about the highway, about the particular afternoon in October when she had opened her car door and run toward fire, about the choice that had seemed, in the moment of making it, less like a decision than like a recognition of something she had always already been. She thought about everything that choice had cost her and everything it had given her in return. The burns on her hands mostly healed now, the bruised ribs long gone, the fear that had run alongside her through the worst of the hospital days, the kindness of a woman with a gray braid who had set a vibrating alarm on a nightstand without being asked, the patience of a man learning a new language at 53 because the person he wanted to know spoke it. She thought about the surgery, about Catherine's assessment and the specialist's careful notes and the specific precise sensation of taking a step without her right leg dragging. The first time she had felt it, in the 4th week of physical therapy, when she had stopped in the middle of the clinic hallway and stood very still for a moment because she wanted to feel it completely before the moment moved on. Stone's hand found hers in the cold morning air. She looked at him. He signed imperfect but unmistakable, the signs she had taught him when she decided those were the ones he should know first. Not alone. She signed back, her hands steady in the cold, the mountains behind them, enormous and quiet, and entirely indifferent to whether this moment mattered. She signed not alone. The sun came up over the mountain and filled the compound with cold gold light, and Linda Armstrong, who had been born into a silence that the world had spent 22 years trying to teach her, was a limitation, stood in the morning of a new year with her legs steady beneath her and her hands open and her eyes clear. She had run into fire once. She would run into it again if the world required it. But today the world was not requiring anything of her except this, to stand here on a porch in the mountains, in the light that was finally coming. She stood there, and she was entirely, completely, unquestionably alive. 3 months later, in the early February cold that the Arizona mountains wore with an indifferent elegance, Linda walked across the main yard of the compound without her right leg dragging, without the slight compensatory lean she had spent 2 years developing, without fully realizing she had developed it, without the bracing fear of the ground coming up faster than expected. She had been doing this for 3 weeks, walking normally or close enough to normal that the difference was measurable only to Catherine, who measured it with the particular satisfaction of a clinician who had spent months waiting for a trend line to reverse. But it still surprised her sometimes, the absence of the drag, the way her body could just move without negotiating with itself. Stone was standing at the edge of the yard when she came through the door. He had been watching, she realized, from the way his expression settled when he saw her coming, some tension releasing from his shoulders that he had probably not been aware he was carrying. He signed when she reached him, his hands careful and increasingly assured. "You look different." Linda signed back, "Different how?" He thought about this for a moment, his brow creasing slightly in the way it did when he was working out how to say something precisely in a language he was still building. Then he signed, like someone who was not waiting for the ground to fail. She laughed. She could not hear herself laugh, but she felt it in her chest, warm and real, and she saw it reflected in Stone's face, that particular softening that she had come to understand meant he was seeing exactly what he wanted to see. They stood together in the February morning, and Linda thought about what it had taken to get to this specific point in time, to this yard, to this man standing beside her, to this particular way of occupying her own body that she had not been certain she would ever have back. The federal trial of Dennis Hogan was scheduled for April. Carol Weaver had communicated the latest developments 2 days earlier, with Esteban Ruiz's cooperation added to the financial documentation William had assembled and the physical evidence recovered during the arrests. The prosecution's case was substantially stronger than the defense team had apparently anticipated when they had agreed to take Hogan's representation. Blackwood's cooperation agreement had produced additional detail about the operation's internal communications that was, according to Weaver, extremely useful. Linda's testimony was still scheduled. That had not changed. She had known it would not change, and she had made her peace with it in the way she made peace with things that were necessary and uncomfortable by looking at them directly and accepting them as part of the cost of being the person who had made the choice she had made on Highway 87 in October. She had spoken with the federal victim advocate assigned to her case, a woman named Sarah, who communicated through a certified ASL interpreter and who had been patient and thorough in explaining every aspect of what the trial would involve. The cross-examination would be difficult. Hogan's defense team would attempt to undermine her account of the highway attack by focusing on her deafness, the argument being that her visual perception of the truck's trajectory was inconsistent with her inability to hear the auditory context of the incident. This was a strategy that Weaver had flagged early and that the prosecution had prepared a response to, specifically the testimony of 3 traffic engineers who had independently reviewed the recovered footage from Linda's own dash camera, which had been running during the crash and had captured exactly what she had described. She had been glad in a complicated way about the dash camera, not because she had doubted her own perception. She never had, but because having the footage meant that her testimony would be corroborated by evidence that did not require anyone to simply take the word of a young woman who could not hear what she was describing. She knew what that meant. She had navigated that specific tension her entire life. April came with warmth that arrived earlier than usual in the desert, and with the trial date circled in the awareness of everyone in the compound in the way significant things were circled, not spoken of constantly, but always present as a reference point. Linda drove to Phoenix with Stone Whalen and May, with William following in a separate vehicle. Carol Weaver met them at the courthouse and walked Linda through the testimony preparation with the same thoroughness she had brought to everything across the past several months. Linda had done this preparation 4 times by now, and the 5th time felt like something she could move through rather than something she had to brace for. The courtroom was ordinary. She had expected it to feel more significant, and it did not. It was just a room with particular furniture, arranged in a particular way, and people whose faces she could read, even when she could not hear a word of what they were saying. The interpreter was seated to her right and slightly forward, positioned to be visible in her direct line of sight while she faced the witness stand. Hogan's defense attorney was a man whose face Linda had studied carefully in advance of this day, not because she needed to, but because she had found that understanding a person's face in advance of a difficult conversation made the difficult conversation easier. He had sharp eyes and the practiced neutrality of someone who did this for a living and was good at it. She had expected him to be good at it. She told the truth. She told it the way she told everything, precisely in detail, without embellishment or retreat, answering each question as it was asked, and not more than it was asked, letting the interpreter's hands translate her signs into the spoken record while she maintained a calm that was not performance but genuine, the real calm of someone who knows what they know and is not afraid of having it examined. The cross-examination went exactly where Weaver had said it would go. The defense attorney argued carefully and with great technical precision that her visual account was incomplete without auditory context. Linda let him make the argument. Then she waited for the redirect and answered the question she had been waiting to answer. The prosecutor asked Miss Armstrong, "Is it your testimony that the truck's movement was deliberate rather than accidental? And if so, what is the basis for that assessment, given that you cannot hear?" She signed. The interpreter translated. She said, "I have spent 22 years navigating a world designed for people who can hear. I have learned to read what I cannot hear through what I can see. I watched that truck match the speed and position of those motorcycles for nearly a full mile before it turned into them. I watched the steering wheel move through the gap in the truck's windshield deliberately. No one who has spent their life paying the kind of attention I have to what they can see rather than what they can hear would misread what I saw." She paused, then continued. "The dash camera footage shows exactly what I described. I did not need to hear the truck to know what it was doing. I needed to watch it. I watched it." The prosecutor had nothing further. The defense attorney did not pursue it. Hogan was convicted on 7 counts 4 months later in a verdict that Weaver communicated to Linda by text message on a Thursday morning when Linda was in the middle of a physical therapy session in Payson. Catherine saw Linda read the text and saw her expression and knew without being told what it said. Linda put the phone down on the treatment table and sat for a moment, feeling the particular complex quality of that specific kind of relief. Not joy exactly, not triumph, more like the completion of something that had needed to be completed, the closing of a parenthesis that had been open since October. She texted Stone a single word: convicted. His reply came in 30 seconds. He did not use words. He used the sign photographed from his hands that she had taught him when she decided those were the ones he should know first. Family. The summer that followed was the first summer in 2 years in which Linda was not spending every available mental resource on the intersection of her medical situation and her savings account. The surgery costs had been handled. The recovery had progressed beyond what the specialist had originally projected as the optimistic outcome, which Catherine attributed to a combination of the procedure's success and the fact that Linda had been exceptionally compliant with the physical therapy protocol. She had started teaching sign language. This had happened organically, beginning with Stone and then expanding to William, who had taken his self-taught foundation and asked her to formalize it, and then at May's suggestion to a class offered through the community center in Payson that she drove to on Tuesday evenings. The class had 8 students ranging from a grandmother who wanted to communicate with her deaf grandchild to a high school student who discovered he was genuinely good at it. Linda taught with the particular patience of someone who had spent a lifetime on the other side of communication barriers and knew very specifically what it felt like to be met or not met by the effort of the person across from her. Stone came to 2 of the classes. He sat in the back and did not participate in the structured exercises, just watched, and afterward on the drive back to the compound, he would practice specific signs he had seen in class and ask her to correct him when he got them wrong. She corrected him. He corrected himself. He got better. On an August evening, when the heat had finally broken enough for the desert to feel like it was breathing again, Linda sat with Stone on the compound porch as the sun went down and signed something she had been thinking about for a few weeks without finding the right moment to say. She signed, "I want to stay here." Stone looked at her. His hands moved, asking what she meant, even though she suspected he understood exactly what she meant. She signed, "I have my apartment in Scottsdale. I have a job at the print shop. I have a life that I built there, a real one, and I know that. But I want to build something here, with you, with all of this. If that is something you want too." Stone put down the coffee he had been holding. He looked at her for a long moment with the expression she had learned meant he was not going to say the first thing that came to mind, but the thing he had actually thought through. Then he signed slowly, making sure each movement was right, because this was the kind of sentence that deserved precision. "I have been waiting for you to say that since about the 2nd week of November." Linda felt warmth move through her chest, complete and unhurried. She signed, "You could have said it first." He signed back, "You needed to say it first." That was important. She thought about that. He was right. She had needed to say it first to know that it was her choice made freely from a place of genuine wanting, rather than from any of the pulls that might have been confused with it, gratitude or circumstance, or the particular gravity that forms between people who have been through something dangerous together. It was her choice, freely made. She was certain of that in the way she was certain of very few things, with the quiet, unargued conviction of something she had come to know by living it, rather than by reasoning toward it. Stone's large hand covered hers. Outside, the desert was settling into its evening self, the light going golden and long, the air cooling by degrees in the way only desert air could cool suddenly and completely, as though someone had made a decision about it. She thought about the highway, about the October afternoon that had changed every coordinate of her life. She did not think about it the way she had thought about it in the first months, with the residue of adrenaline and fear. She thought about it now as the beginning of a story rather than a crisis, as the moment when a choice she had made with her whole self had led her to a different kind of life than the one she had been carefully, scrupulously, impossibly trying to maintain. She had been trying to save $11,000 against a $150,000 gap. She had been trying to hold together 2 jobs and a medical timeline, and a body that was quietly betraying her, and a world that did not always remember to account for her existence. She had been doing all of this with a competence and a stubbornness that was entirely hers and that she was genuinely proud of. And then she had opened a car door and run toward fire, not because it solved any of her problems, not because anyone had asked her to, or because she was certain it would end well, but because she was the kind of person who could not stand still when someone needed help and nobody else was moving. That choice had led here, to this porch, to these mountains, to a community that had found her in the middle of a crisis and decided, without being asked, that she was one of them, to a man who was learning her language with the same patient, methodical seriousness he brought to everything that mattered to him, to legs that held her weight without apology. She signed because it was the thing that was true and the thing that mattered most to say, "Thank you for everything." Stone looked at her. Then he signed back the signs he had learned, first the ones she had decided were the most important. Not alone. The sun finished setting behind the mountains. The compound settled into its evening rhythm. Around them, the familiar warmth of a place where people had decided to be. She had been born into silence. She had been told throughout her life, in 100 ways, large and small, that the silence was a limitation, a gap between her and the world that would always require bridging, always require extra effort, always require someone on the other side to extend themselves across the distance. She had spent 22 years bridging that distance, largely alone, with the stubbornness and competence that were entirely her own, never asking for more than the accommodation of basic consideration, learning to carry the weight of being understood as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be known. And then one afternoon, on an ordinary highway, she had stopped waiting for an invitation. She had opened her car door and run toward fire. She had gotten there and done what needed to be done with the tools she had, and those tools had been enough, more than enough, because they were hers, built across a lifetime of learning to read the world without sound, to feel the vibration of things before they became audible, to understand the shape of a moment before it fully declared itself. Those tools had not changed. She had not changed, but the world she was living in had changed because she was living in it differently, surrounded by people who had recognized what she was and claimed her for it, rather than in spite of it. She was not waiting anymore. She was not standing at the edge of anyone's highway, watching from a distance while the world did what it did. She was here, in the middle of it, her feet on the ground, her hands open, her eyes clear and watching. She was entirely, completely, unquestionably alive, and that was everything.